All right, welcome back everybody to Living Together. For those of you just joining us on Zoom, welcome for the first time. And for those of us that have been here in the room since 9 o'clock, thank you for staying all the way through. And thank you to those on Zoom too, who have come to multiple sessions today. So today we are here for the last panel on Tuesday, which is Towards Metro 2050, Equity Report and Mapping Tools. So I'll quickly introduce myself because I forgot to do that in the first session this morning. I'm Michelle Hoare. I'm the project director of Hey Neighbour Collective. And we are very lucky to have two speakers here today from Metro Vancouver, Erin Rennie, who is the senior regional planner, and Laurie Bates-Frymel, the senior environmental planner. And they will go through some interesting presentations for you. And we'll have an opportunity to ask questions and also give them some feedback and ideas about what you could potentially do with the kind of mapping work that they're doing. So before I keep going, I do want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. Very privileged to be able to do this work on these lands. We also have closed captioning for the session. So for those who are joining us for the first time, you'll find that at the bottom. If you're having any issues with it, you can just ask for help in the chat and somebody should be able to help you out with that. So I just want to thank our providers for that service today. And in the room, if you haven't figured that out yet, there are QR codes on your table to access that as well. So very basic agenda today. I've got a little bit of context setting to do. We'll dive into presentations from Erin and Laurie, and then we will do questions as we have been so far today through Slido. So for anybody who hasn't tried that yet, you just go to sli.do on your phone or computer, and you enter in the code Metro 2050 for this one. So we'll be using that for the question period. But today we also want to get a little bit of feedback and ideas. So the question is, and of course I didn't write this one down, so I'm gonna have to go look at the screen. So what spatial information would you need to do your work more equitably? So whether you're a planner or a developer, or maybe you're in public health, what kind of mapping would you need to help you do your work better? So that's the question we're going to leave you with to think about as you're hearing from Erin and Laurie. And then when we get a little bit further on, or actually really all the way throughout, please feel welcome to use the chat on Zoom to kind of weigh in with your ideas. What information could you use that would help you do your work in a more equitable fashion? In the room here, we'll do that on good old sticky notes. And then we'll have a little bit of time at the end for folks to come up to the mic and let Erin and Laurie know some of the things that they've written down. So the sessions won't be facilitated, so I'm just going to rely on people to volunteer to come up to the mic, and we'll have a few minutes to do that. Okay. So we went through Slido. So apologies for those who have already heard this, but Hey Neighbour Collective started as a pilot project at the city of Vancouver, and it evolved into being a larger collective of many, many partners. The core who are doing some form of intentional programming to build community, social connectedness, and resilience in multi-unit housing. So 3 of those partners are rental housing operators, and 3 are nonprofits, all doing various different kinds of things to bring residents together. We provide a space for those partners to learn from each other in a community of practice, and to have space and time to actually reflect on their own practices, which is something right? We don't get invited to sit back with other people who are doing the same kind of work as us and say, is what I'm doing working? What could I do differently? What could I learn from other people? And so that's what we host in the those partners with researchers. So gerontology, urban studies, and health sciences. And the 3 questions that we're really, or the 4 questions we're really looking at kind of big scale at this project are, what is the role of intentional programming within multi-unit housing? And what kind of impact can it have on resident well-being? So that's a central question. And also, what is the impact on partner organizations? So is it actually improving life or business for a rental housing provider when they're doing this? Is there a business case to be made for investing in doing smart programming with your residents? And how do we do great programming in a building that might not be well designed for bringing residents together? And then what can we learn along the way to influence so during the presentation about fluid too, for example, as we want to reimagine how we build so that it fosters more interactions between neighbors. And then we're looking really at opportunities for systems change. So we have a lot of partners, municipalities, health authorities, regional governments, Landlord BC, BC NPHA. And so all together, we're kind of looking at what are the policy conversations we need to have? What are the systems changes we're trying to impact together? So one of the ways that we've done some of that kind of multi-sectoral dialogue is starting with research, kind of looking at what we know about social connectedness, what we know about housing and how that impacts upon that. And then taking a conversation out to all of our various partners who are actually trying different things in housing, and to policymakers that we're involved with, and to housing associations, and then doing things like a discussion paper for to inform the consultation process that that has given rise to Metro 2050. So that was a really interesting experiment for us, and what we ended up with was a much bigger project than we thought we were taking on, but also something that I think will serve us for years, because it really grounded us in the research and in what we wanted to work at, not just in individual building scales, but at kind of neighborhood urban planning scales. So we're very happy to report that the draft version of Metro 2050, anyway, contains a little nugget that we really like. And so when member municipalities, if this passes, as is written, will need to include in their regional context statements how their policies and actions will lead to increased social connectedness in multi-unit housing. So we're just going to keep pressing along with that and just going to keep working that little nugget. So some of our recommendations, the top one was that Metro 2050 needed to have an overarching social equity lens to it and strategy to it, and we'll be hearing more about that now. And I won't go through all of these, but in various different ways, we're kind of working on all of these recommendations over time at Hey Neighbour Collective in different scales. Before we launch into this, just a reminder of the community guidelines, especially for those of us joining us newly on Zoom. You know, we're all friendly, neighborly people here. Let's keep it that way, especially in chat. There will be zero tolerance for abusive or discriminatory behavior. And there are people watching for it on chat. So, you know, I don't think I have to make this crowd really think about that too hard, but let's just all behave nicely. And then lastly, I just want to acknowledge our sponsors. You know, they're little logos on a slide, but they've made a really big difference in this. And so Vancouver Coastal Health, and we have a few people here in the room, the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, BC Nonprofit Housing Association, Landlord BC, United Way, Van City, and the Real Estate Foundation of BC. So thank you very much to all of our sponsors who have made a lot of this possible. So, and now I will turn it over to Erin.
Good afternoon, everybody. So nice to see you. Can I get a thumbs up virtually or in real life from everybody in both rooms if you okay? Great. Okay, and can you see my first slide? Oh, no? How do I go back? Ta-da! Hi, okay, so I'm Erin Rennie. This is my colleague Laurie Bates-Frymel. We are senior planners at Metro Vancouver. We work in the regional planning department, and we're here to talk about some work that we've been doing recently on the topic of social equity. And again, can you make it come back, please? Because it turns out that social equity actually has a lot to do connectedness. So that's part of why we're so interested in the Hey Neighbor work. So in our presentation, we're quickly going to tell you about what we're doing with regional planning right now. We'll tell you about our study, and then we'll share some really maps are useful to some of you in this room today. And then Laurie's going to tell you a bit about our next steps, and then we've got some time for Q&A and dialogue. So Michelle asked you to take a few minutes to think about this question, and I would really love to see people pulling out a piece of paper from their notebooks and thinking about what could I do if I had better information when it comes to leading to more socially equitable outcomes for the work that I do. What kind of information would you need? Is it spatial information like maps, or is it some other kind of information? And what would you do once you got that information? So be thinking about our presentation as we're showing our maps. Okay, so this is Metro Vancouver, the geography. We work for Metro Vancouver, the organization. We're a regional district, and what that means is that we are a federation of member jurisdictions. So we serve our membership. There are 21 municipalities, there's a Treaty First Nation, and there's the electoral area. And once a month, representatives from all of those councils, those community councils, come together at the Metro Vancouver board to make decisions about matters of regional significance, issues that impact all of us. And one of those issues is population growth. We are a growing region. We know that we are going to grow by about 1 million additional people living in this region by the year 2050. And so one of the questions that we ask ourselves at Metro Vancouver is, how are we going to accommodate all of those new residents in a way that supports livability and social connectedness and sustainability, and protects the kinds of lands that we really value in this region, like conservation areas, agricultural lands, and supports a thriving economy and all the other things that we care about. And so that's one of the reasons why we're so interested in the work that you're doing here with the Hey Neighbor Collective, because as you can see on this map, we have a limited land base. We don't have space to continue to sprawl out over a large geography. So as we're welcoming more and more people to this region, more and more of us are going to be living in multifamily communities. We need to grow up. And how can we be building those multifamily communities in a way that supports the things that we care about? Communities where that are just great places to live. So the way that we do our work is through a document called a regional growth strategy. Our current regional growth strategy is called Metro 2040. And for the last 3 years, we have been working with the community, with our membership, to develop Metro 2050, which is the new updated regional growth strategy that's going to take us out to the year 2050. It is full of policies and actions and a vision for a more livable region by the year 2050. It's organized around these 5 goals. And something that's kind of new in this iteration of the regional growth strategy is we've been asking ourselves, how can we work towards these goals in a way that also supports social equity? I think that is something that it has been implicit for the decades preceding this regional growth strategy, but not necessarily explicit. And I think there's a growing recognition that social equity is connected to all of these other regional issues, like climate change and resilience and the environment and housing. So that's something we've been asking ourselves. That's one of the reasons we've been working with Hey Neighbor. They've provided us with this really great policy brief that did help to inform the draft of Metro 2050. And it is no longer in draft form. We do have a final version, and it is out with your community decision makers now. They are considering whether they're ready to accept it. So I do want to talk about this social equity study that we've been working on concurrently to the development of Metro 2050. So we started this work in 2019, and we sort of scoped it around 3 different phases. That first phase, we took a look at what other regions around the world are doing to consider social equity when it comes to regional growth planning and regional transportation planning. Then in 2020, 2021, we took a deep dive and looked at our own region, and we wanted to find out what are the high priority social equity concerns for people in this region today. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time in our presentation. And then this third phase that Laurie's going to speak to is all about taking that work from the first two phases and putting it into action. So Phase 2 report is online. We have 49 delightful maps on our website, and you can go and find those right now. We'll also share the links for all that information. But like I said, we hired some consultants to take a look at what are the high priority social equity concerns for people in the region today. And they took two approaches. First was they took a qualitative approach. They interviewed people, they did focus groups, and they developed a report around that. And then they also took a quantitative approach. So they mapped indicators related to social equity, and that produced this, what we're calling an inequity baseline data report. That is basically 49 different maps that all have this sort of purple shading that I'm going to walk through in just a second. And each map has a different indicator that the literature shows is connected to social equity in one way or another. So let me teach you how to read these maps really quickly. So first of all, I wonder if it's possible to turn the lights out. Is there any concerns about turning the lights out so that you can read them a little bit better? So basically, the purple color indicates how the level of the social equity consideration. So in this map right here, we're looking at urban tree canopy. So the darker the purple, the lower the urban tree canopy, and the lighter the purple, the higher the urban tree canopy. The little squares that you see on this map, those are just a unit of analysis called a traffic area zone. That's how we do our planning at Metro Vancouver. That's how TransLink does their planning. So that's what we chose to use. It's not what you would see if you looked at census information. And then you'll see that there are some areas on this map that are not purple at all. We hid that information because those are areas outside the urban containment boundary. They're largely conservation lands or agricultural areas that are not intended for urban development. So we didn't want to show that information. So there are 49 different maps, and they each represent a different indicator. There are two broad categories of indicators. There's demographic indicators to do with who is living where are the different concentrations of different sorts of identities, and then there are conditions. So equity conditions related to things like economics, housing, environment, access to transportation, health and safety, and of course, social connectedness. So I want to show you just a few examples. Is there any way to make that little Zoom menu at the top go away so I can read what's on this slide? It shouldn't be on your laptop. Here we go. So this is where all the seniors are living in our region. The darker the purple, the higher the concentration of seniors. So in this map, the darkest purple squares are showing neighborhoods that have over 40% of their residents are over the age of 65.
Quick question, then, is the size of the traffic areas based so that it's the same number of people live in the traffic areas?
I believe so, yeah. Can you advance the slides, please? Okay, so here's another one about medium home value. Here's another one about gentrification risk. This is an index score, so the darker the purple, the higher the gentrification score. Here is one about access to parks and open spaces. So the darker the purple, the lower the general access to park within 10-minute walk. Here is an example of a map about transportation. So this is your transportation cost burden. Folks living in a dark purple neighborhood here are people who are spending more of their household income on transportation costs. So you can see some pretty stark differences in our region. Here is one about a strong sense of community belonging. So I included this because I thought it would be of high interest to this group. Also, again, some pretty stark differences across our region. Here's one about, very connected to the last one, long-term residency. So folks in the darkest purple squares on this map are places where people are very likely to have moved in the past 5 years. And we also include some vulnerability, some environmental and climate vulnerability information here. So here's one about flood risk. And what our consultants were able to do was use a complex mathematical process to combine all 49 maps into a single index layer. And what you're looking at here in the dark red are the places where there are more different and overlapping equity considerations concentrated in a single area. And then the opposite is true for the darker blue areas. And what's really interesting about this map is the dark red areas and the dark blue areas are shaded that color for different reasons. So it's so important to dig into the various indicators contributing to those outcomes to really understand why before you start to take action. And now I'll pass it over to Laurie.
Okay. Thanks very much, Erin, and hello, everybody. Before I move on into some of the slides here, I'd like to pose that question to you that Erin posed at the very beginning and that Michelle had mentioned. So by show of hands and thumbs up, how many of you can see yourselves using some of the maps that we've produced? Okay, a few. Great, good. Okay, wonderful. If you'd like to get a hold of the data, Erin is the person to contact. So we'd encourage you to get a hold of Erin, send her an email, and you can also potentially let her know in terms of how you might use that information. That's great. We're just kind of keeping a tab on who's using this information and what you're using it for, and that actually helps us to build the case for doing more work in this area. So. All right, so next on the slide here, I just want to recognize the fact that this information is currently only available through Erin. Unfortunately, we would like to put it on our open data website at some point at metrovancouver.org/data. It's not there at this point, so it's not totally publicly available, but that's because we're hoping to update some of the maps with the new census data. That isn't going to be fully available until later on this year, so we'll be updating some of those maps in early 2023, and then hopefully we'll have that information on our website on metrovancouver.org/data. In addition, we're going to be working with our GIS staff to potentially make that information a bit more user-friendly, so it's not just in a geodatabase file that you might be able to use on ArcGIS. You can potentially actually use it on an online platform, such as a web viewer or a story map or something like that. So stay tuned for that. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to forward the slides. There we go. All right. Do want to also acknowledge the fact that several municipalities in our region have received this information. They've requested and received this information. So there's some leaders in terms of the folks who are using all of the data sets, as well as the mapping that we have done through our consultant. Burnaby, Surrey, Port Moody, they're doing a lot of great work, in particular related to emergency preparedness and climate planning, extreme weather, and capital projects. So a lot of work is actually using this data, and if you'd like access to it, to move that information forward, please, as I said, get a hold of Erin. All right, so let's talk about phase 3. This is an exciting opportunity for Metro Vancouver to build on some of the mapping that we've done. In terms of what we're going to do for phase 3, 4 main thrusts or main work streams for phase 3. Number 1 that I'm most excited about is we're going to be piloting spatial analysis that relates specifically to social equity. And to do this, we are going to hire a consultant to take the data sets that we have, hopefully do a little bit of questioning whether we might need to update some of those data sets. And we'll also be involving the help of a steering committee, which is going to be a great resource for us to test some ideas and potentially build on this through the spatial equity analysis. So we've got folks from Vancouver Coastal Health, we've got some health authority representatives, some planners, and we've got some academics who are interested in being involved in the steering committee for this work. In addition, we've got the second bullet here highlighted in particular because this is one of our opportunities to raise awareness about these data sets and these maps, and to get the information out in the real world to be used by you and others. So Erin's also going to be presenting later on in July, beginning of July, at the Canadian Institute of Planners conference. And so if you're going to that one, you'll hopefully be able to take that session in as well. In addition, we're hoping to do some webinars and share the maps through the webinars. You may be interested in what we're going to be doing with Metro 2050. Well, hopefully it's going to be adopted in July. We'll see about that. But in terms of what we'll be doing, we'll be taking a look at Metro 2050, the language that is hopefully going to be finalized in July, and then taking a look at it more so through a social equity lens than we already have done. Possibly identifying some areas within the document to improve the language or the policy language around social equity, as well potentially through an amendment to Metro 2050, but also possibly identifying some implementation guidelines that will help our members to implement some of the social equity related policy language. And in addition, we're going to be sharing all of the lessons learned through each of these items in the process for phase 3 with our Regional Planning Advisory Committee and anybody else who is interested in learning some of the lessons through our spatial analysis and our sharing. So hopefully you folks also might be interested in that information. Now, what do I mean by a case study? With the first bullet was talking about these spatial equity case studies. I'm going to be using the van play example, which we think is a great example of a case study. Van play is the Vancouver Park Board's master plan for parks and recreation. And essentially, they used 3 maps that they overlaid on top of each other. So they looked at areas where there were gaps in park access. They overlaid that with areas of high demand for low barrier recreation. And then they also took another map looking at urban forestry, or urban forest gaps, or urban forest canopy gaps, I should say. And so they overlaid each of those 3 maps, and then they created what they're calling initiative zones through a composite map, which basically took those 3 indicators, and where there were inequity issues associated with 3 of those indicators overlapping or intersecting each other, then they are hopefully going to be focusing programs in those areas to alleviate some of that inequity in terms of recreational opportunities. So that's what we mean by a case study. Well, one of the case studies that I'm particularly passionate about being, because of the fact that I'm an environmental planner, is one where we're going to take a look at some of the information about urban heat. So we'll be taking this map in particular, hopefully updating it. This information that's on this map is from August 2020. I would like to update this information with June 2021 to see how it changes or it differs from August 2020. So we'll take that information and overlay it with our urban tree canopy information. We have a regional data set that shows urban tree canopy. We'll basically flip this one around to show the gaps in urban tree canopy. And then the next, another potential opportunity for overlaying one of these maps is people to confide in. So of course that's an indicator for social isolation. And of course, folks who were isolated during the heat dome last year were very vulnerable, and a lot of them suffered from heat-related mortality and morbidity. So that this is one particular analysis that we're fairly passionate about moving forward. Also want to recognize that the information that's on this particular map came from the My Health, My Community data set, so nod to our Vancouver Coastal Health folks who led that work, hoping that they'll be able to update that information in the next couple of years, so we'll be able to provide a bit of a comparison between the two data sets. But I'm looking forward to working with Vancouver Coastal Health and the other health and Fraser Health and many of the experts across the region to refine this particular case study and a few others. And with that, that is the end of our presentation. Very excited to have a conversation with you about how you might use these maps, what kinds of tweaks we could potentially do to enhance some of the case studies that we'll be looking at, and any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
That's great. Can you hear me okay out there in the room? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. I just wanted to comment that I really saw kind of a striking similarity in concept here with the last presentation with fluid, where Bruce and his colleagues kept coming back to this idea of tools not being able to predict exact outcomes and exact scenarios, but giving you a comparison so that you know where to invest resources, right? And I think this is what your maps are doing. It's showing where you really need to invest resources if you're looking through a social equity lens. So I like that.
Indeed.
So if you haven't had a chance to submit some questions in Slido, we can keep taking them at any time, and I'm just going to start going from the top. And I would encourage you to think about, how you would use them, maps like this or data like this. So you could, if you're on Zoom, you can put those ideas in the chat. And if you're here in person, you can write them on a sticky. And in a little bit, I will invite my colleague Robin, who is our Zoom host, to read off some of the stuff that's coming into the chat. And I will invite anybody who would like to step up to the microphone to share some of your thoughts on that. So first question, was there some form of weighting in combining the different equity maps into the overall index map? How was this decided on, and could this be varied for different contexts or purposes?
Yes, okay, so great question.
Are you ready?
I am not a GIS specialist, so I have a very high level understanding of how this works. So it's called principal component analysis, and it is a thing that you can do if you know about GIS and math. And basically what it does is it takes all of those maps and it analyzes them, and it looks at what patterns are probably being caused by the same thing. So if you're seeing the same pattern over and over again in your transportation maps and your demographic maps and your economic maps, maybe they're all caused by, I don't know, this neighborhood is very wealthy, so they would downweight that those indicators because they don't want to overly inflate it, because all those different indicators are probably being caused by an outside cause. So that's the process. There is a lovely description of it for those of you who are interested on our website. I'm happy to connect you with that information. But yes, there was a way of weighting it, and it was using math.
Okay. Let's see. Next one. Is there data or an indicator to see the community building resources in neighborhoods? So spaces, facilities, organizations, that kind of thing.
That's an interesting question. I mean, we haven't mapped that information, but that's something that I think could be mapped through GIS.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. You would need almost like taking an inventory, I guess, of what exists in a community. You would need to collate
all of that information at the municipal and then even at the regional level. It would be a big endeavor to do that, but you could also code that information to show, to potentially take people to a website and provide additional information about the services and functions of each of the organizations, and potentially say, here's the head office, or here's the areas that they could cover.
Right.
Yes.
I do know we have some kind of co-conspirators in Ontario working on something called the Oasis Project, which is a program to bring seniors living in what are called NORCs, so naturally occurring retirement communities. And the Oasis team, there are a bunch of researchers that are working with different buildings that are doing this kind of neighbor-based model. They did some really interesting mapping of where there were buildings with a high degree of seniors, so NORCs, like actually kind of mapping out where the NORCs were in different communities, but then also looking at where there were neighborhoods that had very low services and amenities for seniors. So that again enabled them to kind of zoom in on some neighborhoods where they might want to concentrate their efforts and resources. Nice. All right, so we've got, how could these maps show the destruction from TMX in Burnaby? This pipeline prep has destroyed a lot of tree canopy.
I can speak to that one.
Okay.
Yes, I am involved at this point in updating our sensitive ecosystem inventory and our land cover classification data set. And we take the land cover classification and we translated that into tree canopy cover based on the integration of mature trees and young trees, deciduous trees, and coniferous trees. We're going to be updating that data set as well, and we will see if there is a change from 2014 to 2020. And then we'll also be projecting that into the future as well.
These are great questions. We're really good deep here. Based on the urban heat map mentioned at the end, with the overlap of tree canopy and people to confide in, how would you identify those gaps? Sorry, these keep moving. Okay. How would identifying those gaps be turned into actions in the community? Or would that involve additional engagement once identified? So I guess this is a question both about identifying the gaps, but then how do we actually use this information to act on it? Like what's that next step? And I guess maybe how far does the role of Metro extend, beyond the production of maps and offering of data sets?
Exactly. So I can comment on that. For that particular case study, I would see it as identifying areas of opportunity for intervention. And we're not going to identify those interventions that are needed.
Right.
We're simply going to identify those areas and then pass the information on to our member jurisdictions, and they will facilitate conversations about potentially, identifying opportunities for those particular areas. And I'm sure it will involve engagement. For one example of an intervention might be planting trees. It might be cooling centers. It might be, retrofits for a senior center or for a seniors facility, those kinds of things. And we'll leave it up to the member jurisdictions, to our municipalities, to start those conversations in the community.
Okay, great. For non-census data, and specifically subjective or anecdotal questions, for example, people to confide in, how is data gathered? In which languages, and was it done offline or online? You're dealing with a lot of different data sets, so It's probably different answers for different data sets.
Yeah, so for that one, that question came from the My Health, My Community data set that the Health Authority gathered through their survey. So I believe that was done in a variety of different languages, and they had all sorts of amazing methods that they used to make sure they got a really representative sample. The limitation of that data is it's from 2014, so it really needs to be updated. But yes, our data is coming from all different kinds of sources, and so that makes it really interesting because some of it is they're different years and sort of different approaches for gathering info.
Right. Okay, great. My question, not mine, but someone from Slido, is about the title of maps. It seems the maps are produced based on the composite indicators. For example, how did you calculate sense of belonging? Is that?
Yeah, that also came from My Health, My Community. So I think that was just a self-reported sense of belonging based on some kind of scale. You can probably find more info on their atlas, the My Health, My Community atlas.
And then I'll just do a little plug here. And Laura, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you've got a survey that's live and that's going to try to update some of this kind of information.
So the survey parts that are listed with the COVID speak data, that's for the survey link, that's going live within the month. And that's going to replicate some of the data from My Health, My Community, not all of it. Still quite COVID focused, but it will be incorporating some of the original My Health, My Community parts that it's finally working towards improving this one.
Okay, so for those not in the room, because you probably couldn't hear Laura responding in the room, but Vancouver Coastal Health does have a survey that's out, and we'll try to get the link to everybody that participated in either way. And it will update some of those My Health, My Community questions so that we get a newer data set for some of these more kind of well-being and social connectedness questions. How user-friendly are these map data sets? Do you need to have a specific software and knowledge about how to use it, or can we request an enlarged map of a specific city or neighborhood?
Right, so at this point, we have it as a GIS data set. We, like Laurie said, we have a long-term goal to create some kind of map viewer on our website that is a little bit easier for non-GIS users. But if you had a special request for your specific municipality, we might be able to accommodate you if you just email me and ask me what you're looking for.
And I have a question, actually. Maybe it's somewhere else in here, but do you have to be a municipality to ask for your help? Could you be a community organization? Could you be a research institute? Like, yeah?
Yeah, all of that is fine. To share this information, it's all available, but we do want to know what you're using it for. And the main reason for that is historically, this kind of information hasn't always been used for good. And we really want to make sure that the people who are getting access to this information are thinking about the potential impacts that they might have, and you know, using it to support more equitable outcomes and not.
I'm glad that you said that.
Evil.
That's important.
Don't do evil.
Yes, yes.
Information is not always used for good. It's an important point. What powers does Metro have as a regional body to make interventions in social equity issues, where a majority of Metro's work up to now has been in physical environment?
So the role of Metro Vancouver regional planning is really around developing policy, implementing the growth strategy, convening our membership and their staff, education, knowledge sharing, data and research. That's really what we specialize in, and that's the work that we focus on. So we think that social equity does have something to do with our physical environment. Those two things interact, and so that's sort of what we're exploring in this study. But we don't have a role in service provision necessarily.
Although we do have a role in terms of affordable housing.
True.
We've got our Metro Vancouver Housing Corporation, and so, you know, I mean, the residents of our housing facilities are likely experiencing social isolation. So we do need to also potentially take this information and use it for those purposes as well.
Yeah, that's great. So we have a question about whether the studies will be reproduced year over year to show changes over time to these data points on social equity. And are there previous years of data and reporting available? So I guess what you've shown us is kind of a point in time that you're about to update. So yeah, the question is, can you help people go back to see trends? And is there a commitment to updating this ongoing?
It will be tough, given that we're combining a whole bunch of data sets from many different organizations. But the data sets that we are producing, like the tree canopy cover data, we can report trends over time. So we'll try, I think, but it might be different, and some of the data sets might not be comparable year to year as well. There may be some tweaks in the data that make it such that you can't compare.
So I think the pitch here is the more municipalities use this for good,
yes,
the bigger your department gets and the more you can do. Is that all right, so it's a positive feedback loop.
More GIS resources.
That's right. Curious if your team looked at overdose deaths or opioid-related emergency calls, or more broadly speaking, emergency calls in relation to belonging. I guess what's unclear to me in both presentations is a tension between having data and the political will to invest in communities. It's a biggie.
No, we didn't look at overdose specifically, but I suspect that BC CDC does have that kind of information and that they're making those connections to social connection. So that would be a good place to start. And it's an excellent point around going from data gathering to reporting to generating the political will. So hopefully the more dialogue we have about these things, then we have a place to start when it comes to making change.
Well, and I'll speak to Bruce's point in terms of the fact if you don't have any data, you don't have any way of building a case for something. So you're pointing to these data sets as saying, okay, look, there's an issue here. We need to deal with it. And then that, it informs conversations you have at the political level to make change.
Yeah, okay. So we're getting close to close, and I want to have an opportunity for people to kind of volunteer what kind of information they might need to do their work more equitably. So for those in the room, if anybody has an example of something you would love to see or information you could use, that would be great. And I will also ask Robin maybe to kind of ready herself to let us know if there's anything that has come off the chat. So if the AV team could, nope, not, okay, that's not happening. All right, that's fine, because actually we've got lots more questions. So did anybody want to volunteer any ideas about how they would want to use this information, or keep asking questions? We'll keep asking questions. I think we're having end of the day itis. All right. So I like this one.
Oh, there's a hand over there.
Sorry, I should have waited longer. Can you go up to the mic so that folks on Zoom can see and hear you?
I'm Claire from Catalyst Community Development Society, and we build affordable, well below market housing. So I'm thinking that when we're in the early stages of a project, just looking at these maps to know what issues there are in the area we're looking to build a project would help us with the design. So if, for example, it's a area that's particularly affected by heat, then maybe we look to build some additional cooling into our building design, or if it's an area that doesn't have access to transit, before we actually build the project, working to get that transit in place.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Love
that's
it.
great.
Yeah.
All right, make yourself very obvious if you want to pop in, but how can areas outside of Metro Vancouver go about completing a similar equity analysis? These maps are really quite impressive. My assumption would be that local governments with smaller budgets and capacity would need to hire a consultant to complete this work.
We also had to hire consultants to complete this work. And I'm really happy to share our process with, if there's other planners from other jurisdictions who want some insight, happy to sort of share what we learned through that process.
Okay, great. How granular can the social equity maps go? And will be there, so yeah, let's go with how granular can the social equity maps go?
Yeah. Okay, so we had them produced at the traffic area zone level. It depends where the original data source is. So if the original data source goes really granular, sometimes you can get even more granular if you go back to census website or My Health, My Community, wherever it originally came from. The challenge is that with information that's potentially sensitive at a really granular level, census usually doesn't let you access that information because they want to protect people's privacy. So that's a real tension that I think all of us sort of encounter, is if you want that granular data, you also have to be thinking about protecting people's privacy and what's actually available.
Right, yeah, okay. Is there data on dwelling type that has been mapped across the region in similar ways? Would it make sense to overlay dwelling type with other indicators?
Yes, yeah, we do have that information. Actually, we do that in-house. So that's a great insight. We could experiment with that.
Okay.
Dwelling type and tenure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that information is.
Yeah. Well, you've got the gentrification map, so you're probably seeing kind of change over time in neighborhoods and movement. Okay. I think I'm going to take one last question, and then we will close the session and close the day. So what's next about this for Metro Vancouver, especially in terms of working with local governments for Metro 2050 implementation? Is there thinking about cascading the map to more granular levels to inform neighborhood engagements, or using it to focus on specific areas? So how will you work with municipalities through this?
Can you speak to the first one? I can speak to the second.
Sure. Well, first step is to adopt Metro 2050. That's
plug.
Step one. Immediate next step. And once that's done, we do want to sort of take a retrospective, go through our policies and see if there's any places where we could make tweaks to improve social equity outcomes even more, or if there's ways in terms of implementation we could support more equitable outcomes. And then there are also some policy actions in Metro 2050 for us to do more work in terms of equity research, distributing that amongst our membership.
Right. And in terms of making the information available at a more granular level, we'll start that. I think questions about the case, because I know that there's an interest in having it at a level much more detailed than the traffic area zone. So that's something that I personally would like to make sure that there's more granular information for those case studies. And if we see that that information is being used at the local level, perhaps we can also consider updating some of the other maps that we don't use for the case studies at a more granular level as well.
Okay.
To make sure they're usable. I mean, that's one of our key goals, is to make sure this information is being used in the community.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. This is really important work, and I hope that Metro 2050 gets passed so you can keep digging deeper into this and help local governments and communities really enact some of the changes on the ground to address some of what you're finding in the data. So thank you to everybody that has made it all the way through to the end of a whole in-person session, and to those of you who've been joining us on Zoom, thank you so much. We have a whole other day tomorrow. We've got a morning session with a bunch of housing innovators, and then an afternoon in-person only workshop. So we will, I know, see some of you here again tomorrow, and then some fresh faces as well. So we release you to what I hope is still a sunny day, and hopefully it's sunny for you wherever you are joining us from on Zoom. And wish you well. Thank you very much.